Hi again, everyone. So I miss seeing you as always, but hopefully we're getting a little bit closer to being able to gather in person. All right, so we have spent a lot of time in Genesis with our good friend, faithful Abraham. We've been with him since chapter 12 for 13 whole chapters, since God called him out of his land and led him to follow his promises instead of the things of this world. But after all this time, last week we started to see the camera angle shifting a little bit as his family tree gets bigger to his son Isaac. So last week Isaac found a wife, Rebecca, and we got to see God's hand working faithfully through lots of different characters, through Abraham's servant, through Rebecca, through Rebecca's father, through Isaac, starting to sculpt and pull more people into his plan. So today we're going to finish our chapter with Abraham. Okay, so you all can go ahead and pause the video and read Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 6. Okay, so here we have one more reminder of God's faithfulness to Abraham. We get to see another instance of him being fruitful, not with Sarah this time, but with another wife. So we see God's continuing to bless him, but through that, if you pay attention to verse 5, we see that Isaac is still the one who God has chosen to be the special bearer of his promise and his blessing. So we see Abraham giving all that he has to Isaac. Okay, now we can go ahead and read the next few verses, do chapter 25, verses 7 through 11. All right, so what did you all notice about this final passage on Abraham? We see that it doesn't just say he died, but that he was gathered unto his people. So he may have finished this earthly life, but he has not finished for good. We know that he is just gathered back to a resting place until God's promises are complete and he'll be raised to a new life. And we also see here in verse 11 that the blessing is now fully passed on to Isaac. We see after Abraham dies, God blesses Isaac. So, have any of you all ever been in or seen a relay race? So relay race is when there's usually four people on a team running a race together. And in this race, each person has a baton, which we're going to say the stick is a baton. And they run their leg of the race, maybe a mile, we'll say, and then they pass it off to the next person. And then the next person grabs the baton and then runs their leg of the race and then passes it on to the next person until the final person runs through and crosses the finish line. So that's kind of how we can think of these characters running their earthly life. Abraham has faithfully run his race, and now he's passing off the baton and the plan and the blessing on to Isaac, into Isaac's hands. So now we'll get to see a little bit more of how things work out for Isaac. But before we do that, we are reminded in the next few verses, in, verses 12 through 18 of Ishmael. So So even though Ishmael isn't the main character of the story right now, we get to see another genealogy or list of the people in his family, and we're reminded that God is still keeping his promises to Ishmael and to Hagar and blessing him with fruitfulness. Okay, so now we can move along to see what happened with Isaac and Rebekah. You all can read verses 19 through 21. Okay, so does this sound familiar at all? We see that Rebekah is also barren, like Sarah was barren. But we also see that instead of losing hope, she lifts her eyes and prays and asks that God will give her a child. And God does. He again is faithful. So, if you all haven't noticed already, God's faithfulness and keeping his promise and hearing people's prayer is a continued theme. It just keeps on coming up, keeps on repeating. It's like in the chorus of a song. So if any of you guys have a favorite song, you probably know that there's certain verses and then there's what's called the chorus, which is the part that keeps on repeating throughout the song. And it's usually kind of the most important message that the whole rest of the song revolves around. So God's faithfulness is like the chorus to that song. Okay, so now every time you hear of God's faithfulness or God answering someone's prayer, we can be reminded that that is like the main theme continuing to come back and weave in and out of these people's lives. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and read the next few verses 22 through 28, still in chapter 25. Okay, so here we see that well, first of all, we see the scope is really starting to get big because it's not just that there's twins, but there's two nations, God says, inside of Rebekah's womb. So we know that Esau and Jacob are going to become two whole nations eventually. They're going to expand and expand. And what else do you notice? They aren't getting along. Even from inside the womb, they are trying to sort of get on top of each other, and they aren't getting along. Now, another important thing to notice is how they are described. You might be thinking, okay, why is it telling us that Esau's hairy? What does that matter? But in the Bible, like we learned a little bit last week, when there's a physical outward description of someone, that is trying to give us a clue to what they're like on the inside. So when we read that Esau is hairy, that means that he is kind of beast-like. He's kind of like an animal. So he cares more about the things that beasts care about than thinking, wise. Oh, sorry about that. The beast moved the camera. So he cares more about things of animal nature than he does what people who are wise and looking to God's plans care about. And then Jacob, we see that he is smooth, and his name actually means deceitful. So he is like, let's see, sort of like a smooth, slimy snake that is very tricky. Not necessarily evil, but he is tricky and cunning. Okay, so now we can move on to the next few verses and see their characters come into action a little bit. So you all can read verses 29 through 34 to finish up the chapter. Okay, so now we see that Esau is willing to trade his birthright for a pot of stew. Now, you might be thinking that this is kind of a rough consequence for him to have his entire birthright taken away just because he's hungry. But if you remember what we talked about with Lot's wife, how she turned into a pillar of salt just for looking back towards the wicked city of Sodom and Gomorrah, it was more about a position of the heart, which is reflected in this one action. We see that the promises and the blessing that Abraham and Isaac have been faithfully working so hard to strive after, Esau is ready to trade just for a pot of stew. So he is not seeking the things of God, but he's seeking things of the flesh, the things of this earth. He's just, I'm hungry, like a beast. And then we get to see Jacob come in, slide in sneakily, and take advantage of that beast-like hunger and get him to promise away his birthright. So, we've talked about a lot again, and as we are starting to see the family expand, things are going to start to get a little bit more sloppy between the family relations and in the actions of the characters. So it's important to remember that Bible characters are never, except for Jesus, they are never people that we want to 100% replicate everything that they do. But they are flawed people just like we are, who God is working through. So the little ditty for this week is: God's faithfulness works through fleshly fights to keep his promise to make all things right. So even when brothers are bickering and tricking each other, we know that God's faithfulness will work through that. And for the final reading to close off in chapter 26, verses 1 through 5, we see that even through this, we're reminded God renews his promise to Isaac. So you all can go and read that, and remember that no matter what is going on in our lives, no matter what bickering may occur, God's faithfulness remains. He's continuing to work his good plans, and his promise is now complete in Christ. All right. And I also, before leaving, want to tell you guys you did an incredible job on the prayers last week. That was really, really wonderful to see you all. So I hope to see you again, and it was so encouraging to have you all pray for us. All right. Hope to see you soon. Bye, guys.